Thank you for joining us this morning. We are here for the third and the last session of the 78th IREPAS meeting. As you all know, this session will be a panel discussion, and the chairman of the IREPAS committees are sitting here with me on the stage this morning. You all know them, but let me introduce them one by one. Starting from far left, Mr. Jens Björkman is the chairman of IREPAS Raw Material Suppliers Committee. Mr. Willy Alf is the chairman of IREPAS Traders Committee. And Mr. Murat Cebecioğlu is the chairman of IREPAS Producers Committee, and as you all know, the chairman of IREPAS. Now, first of all, we are going to be listening to the findings of the respective IREPAS committees, and then we will start directing the questions to the chairman and listen to their comments and opinions. Shall we start with the Raw Material Suppliers Committee? Jens, please.
All right. So at this meeting in Warsaw, sunny Warsaw, we were able to gather 40 different raw material suppliers and I believe 62 delegates. 62. Which I think is a record amount of raw material suppliers, so that's great to see. It just proves that it's a good way of meeting in our ferrous industry. We had a discussion yesterday about different topics surrounding our industry, and I'll try to summarize a little bit here. So, since the sort of end of 2015, we've seen a rebound in general commodities and in the raw material side for ferrous as well. And we are in a steady sort of rebound situation. Of course, there's uncertainty and there's fluctuations, but in general, we've had a positive trend. And it's been mainly China-driven because of the declining steel exports from China, which is then with a growing steel sector led to a more of an interest for the ferrous raw materials when it comes to scrap. And we've had discussions about the Chinese scrap generation, which is growing considerably. I believe last year about 148 million tons were accumulated, and of course markets were worried that the Chinese would start exporting a lot, and last year they did. Only a fraction of what they produce, of course, about 2.2 million tons, but the worry is that the Chinese steel production might not be able to shift quick enough. But we heard yesterday, among other things, that the buildup of electric arc furnace capacity is coming online quite fast, and there's quite a lot of investment in that sector to handle scrap generation. And so the group was discussing this and found that the scrap exports might not be coming online in the future. And also there's a 40% export duty on scrap exports. So the European demand for steel and scrap has been boosted by strong growth in the European sector, better than expected. And also the United States continues to perform very well with low unemployment and solid demand. Of course, this the tariffs on steel imports to the United States were discussed, which has boosted raw material demand and perhaps it has for the past year because of discussions about these tariffs and uncertainty about when and why, when and who and what it could lead to, which has itself been a boost for the U.S. steel sector, and also then for the demand for raw materials to that sector. So uncertainty has been one of the words that we were discussing around a few different topics. Okay, there's uncertainty in the United States about the tariffs, which has been a positive uncertainty for at least for the raw material side. And then we were discussing the uncertainty in the Turkish market, which then has been a little bit on the more negative side, or at least could be negative. We have a Turkey that's been having political uncertainty over this election coming up in June, with the constitution in jeopardy, and a weaker devalued lira. But we still have, I believe, 11% strengthened steel production in Turkey this year. So, but the lead times, we were discussing yesterday, the lead times in the industry has come down a little bit. So there's a little bit of uncertainty about demand, mainly due to the lead times coming down, shortening, despite strong demand. Another devalued, another currency topic was the Russian ruble, which came off when there was sanctions imposed on oligarchs. We saw quite a lot of exports from the Russian market. So a little bit of fluctuations in currency has been one of the topics. In the Indian subcontinent, steel asset buildup has been driving demand in the region and the current countries around India. And the Indian growth, as we saw yesterday also on some slides, the growth is outperforming most of others and could be for the next few years as well. So that area seems to be strong on imports of ferrous raw materials in the future. And we have U.S. discussions on multiple negotiations when it comes to NAFTA, when it comes to TPP, so different trade-related issues. We'll have to wait and see.
Thank you very much. Okay, shall we go on with the Traders Committee?
Yeah, the main topic of our Traders Committee, of course, was the trade case of the United States against literally everybody, and the safeguard measurements which have been taken up by the European community, and lately also Turkey, who is investigating to what extent the domestic market can be influenced by those topics. So one of the questions we're going to have will also be in conjunction with that, so I eventually can spare the summary of that. But all in all, yeah, it's probably way too early to really determine what will be the consequence out of that, because it has been suspended now for another 30 days, so nobody knows whether another suspension will come up or whether it will come to a final conclusion and decision, and only after that it can be seen or eventually predicted what reaction from Europe will come to that decision by America. So what we all see is that certainly a rate and a duty of 25% or whatever for everybody would certainly be the best, because then one can continue. But we also realized that for reinforcing bars, at least America has to import rebars. They are not self-sufficient. They cannot cover the demand, which is there, of about 8 million tons. They have a production of 5.8 million tons. So there is a delta which they have to fill, and even with an increased production because of capacity utilization, that will maximum bring 500,000 tons. So there is still a delta of 1.5 million tons. So Turkey, as a biggest exporter, of course, would also suffer the most if they would not be excluded. And Europe only very, very marginally, because America was just a trade target over the last 2 years, eventually from 1 or 2 European countries. So the next point was raw materials. Scrap demand may increase because of the new blast furnaces, which are starting up in China in 2018, as we learned from Mr. Marr. So 40 million tons of scrap will probably be added to the worldwide demand, and that certainly should bring and keep the scrap price in balance, if not even up. On the other side, it is predicted that the spread between iron ore and scrap price also should narrow because of that new demand. Then one of the topics was also forward and future markets, which we discussed with some people from the audience. And yeah, it was asked in these times of price volatility to what extent hedging models should be implemented and what model can be implemented. So we had quite mixed and different opinions on that. Peter Marcus recommended to use scrap as one of the bases for a hedging model, because it's a commodity product. Others were asking why not rebars or wire rod. So the conclusion was that, first of all, the liquidity for the finished products in the market is not sufficient to really use such a model in big scale. And also what was said is that in particular for reinforcing bars, depending on the destination, but taking now Europe, for example, is probably a very unuseful model because of all these different homologations, different sizes, lengths, and so on, different demands and requirements from the customers. So going to Middle East, you need British standard. Going to America, you need air-cooled, and so it's quite a difficult issue to trade and to hedge. You can hedge it as a paper, but if you have a physical supply, then it will be definitely a big issue to supply the right material to the right customer. Then the last item we discussed was the forecast for the various regions in the world, and in conclusion we came to what José from CELSA mentioned yesterday in his report, that every area in the world is really showing positive signs. In particular, Europe, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, France, they are really showing big increases in construction, in demand, for infrastructure, for housing, for new investments. UK is a little bit behind that, probably as a Brexit effect, that some constructions have been put on hold, but even countries like Ireland have come back to the market with better numbers than before, and also Spain reached again over 1 million tons of consumption, which was coming up from something like 850,000 tons in two or 3 years ago. So the same is for Latin America. It looks like Argentina is a driving force there, but also Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia are still, or are robust and are having positive signs for the coming 18 months. So that is the summary of the trader session.
Thank you very much, Willy. Let's hear the producers.
Good morning. Yesterday's attendance to the Producers Committee meeting was one of the highest I've ever seen. Please correct me, I think there were about 48 registries yes. from the producers, and most of them were present in yesterday's meeting. And therefore, we had a chance to discuss and get a feedback from many different parts of the world. And we discussed in detail specific developments in each country, economic developments, and of course the future of the steel in each of these countries. I'll make it short because we're going to go into the details of these in the question part. Almost everyone agrees that there is demand all around, but of course there are also obstacles, there were two major worries. One, what China is going to do, and second, of course, this protectionism, where will it take us? Those two issues have been discussed in detail, and as my colleague said, there is uncertainty, unclarity, and we cannot predict what's going to happen if this goes on like this. These were the major points that has been discussed in our meeting. But in all over, the sentiment was very positive, and for the rest of 2018, that was about.
That was a real summary.
Yeah, that's a summary. So we'll go into the details anyway. So I'm not going to talk about what we talked about, protectionism and everything. It's going to be in the questions.
Okay. Let me quickly recap what I have heard. Excuse me. Obviously, starting with the raw materials committee, we have heard that there is rebound in commodities as well as in scrap since 2015, mainly China-driven rebound. But the raw material suppliers were concerned about the growth in Chinese scrap generation. There were 2 million tons plus exports from China last year of ferrous scrap, obviously. And most of the suppliers were worried that the Chinese production shift might not be quick enough to accommodate the increase in scrap generation. So it is yet to be seen whether Chinese will be increasing their exports to have a significant impact in the market. I have noted that European demand is boosted by strong growth, which is better than expected. Also, the US market performs very well with solid demand. Obviously, the tariffs boosted the raw material demand in the US as well. But still, there is uncertainty in the raw material side as well because of the ongoing situation as regards the protectionism. And these raw material suppliers see uncertainty in Turkish market due to oncoming elections and the devalued currency. Also, the lead times in the industry has come down a little bit. Another currency issue that the raw material suppliers have noted is related to Russian ruble, following the sanctions imposed. And I have also noted that the raw material suppliers are excited about the growth in Indian subcontinent. The Indian growth has been outperforming most other markets, and demand for raw materials is expected to be strong in the future in Indian subcontinent. But obviously, the raw material suppliers are expecting to see the conclusion of the multiple negotiations related to Section 232, and the ongoing or recently started investigations in the EU and Turkey. Coming to traders, once again, the Section 232 has been the major topic of discussion for the traders, according to my notes. Obviously, the investigations, recently started investigations in the EU and Turkish market. The traders mentioned that nobody knows what's going to happen in terms of final conclusions of those negotiations and investigations, so everybody has to wait and see. But I have noted that the traders conclude the best would be to have 25% duty instead of quotas, so that everybody will be on the same situation and business can go on after that. Also, traders mentioned that the US must continue to import rebars as they are not self-sufficient, so there has to be some sort of a compromise there on the US side. Obviously, if the market is closed, Turkey would be the biggest, would have the biggest damage, as they are the biggest exporter to the market. Traders also mentioned that scrap demand may increase due to new mills to be started in China, which may also have an impact on scrap prices, towards higher scrap prices. I have noted that hedging was also discussed by the traders, but traders, there were different opinions, but mostly I understood that they think the liquidity for finished product is not sufficient, and it would be very difficult to hedge finished product business, but there may be possibilities for scrap, which is more of a commodity. The good thing is that the traders forecast positively for almost every market. I noted that the Benelux, France, Spain markets are very good in terms of construction growth and demand for long products, even though UK market is a little bit behind. But Latin American market demand is very good, mostly driven by Argentina, and traders' forecasts are also very positive for Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Finally, producers, here again, producers also agree that demand is good everywhere, but there is obvious uncertainty in the market, mainly because of China and the protectionism. And it is very difficult to predict even the short term, as the uncertainty because of the negotiations under Section 232 and the investigations in Europe and Turkey is still going on. So we can move on to the questions right now. As always, if you have any questions, please. Well, I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but yes. There must be something wrong with me. I should not move, just stand still here. Okay, as always, please stop me whenever you have a question or a comment so that we can have an interactive session. If you don't have any questions, I can start with the questions we have collected. Yes, we have a question. Okay, please go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Could you offer some more color on the scrap to iron ore ratio? You said that the expectation was that the ratio would come in, right? Scrap to iron ore.
Yeah, that it will get narrowed or...
Yeah, well, I mean, what was the ratio discussed? Like, what would it come down to, by when, if there's any other color you can offer?
Sorry.
By when would that ratio come down, and to what?
Well, whether it will come down, no, I cannot say that we said that. But the opinion was more that it will get narrow, so that iron ore obviously will slightly go up, and scrap may slightly go down. Maybe in that relation. So, but we did not really put numbers or figures or whatever, but just that the belief of the people was that it's just narrowing. So, did not answer the question, but
we may see the other thing happen as well. I mean, if you have a Chinese sector that's lowering or have their demand, and then you have another good growth in the rest of the world, you might see it actually widen. But what that number is, it's not a fixed number. It's of course depending on where the market demand is.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm moving on with the first question I have here. This is for the panel, for all of you, gentlemen. What's your opinion regarding the extension of the deadline for exemptions from the Section 232 tariffs? Do you think this delay is just another strategy to keep global players on hold and reduce imports? Are you expecting actual final decisions to be announced by June 1st?
Well, I think... Hello? Well, it's a difficult question. I mean, it's better be over in June the 1st, because there might be some extension exemptions until now, just to arm wrestle and to see what the others are going to do. This is a game US is playing. It's a dangerous game, but it's better be over and by the end of this month, because everyone needs clarity. Everyone is holding on, and they are not sure of what they have to do for the coming months. I mean, it's all everyone's sake that this thing is, I mean, they decide on what to do on NAFTA and the EU, because it will affect the rest of the world. And I believe they will decide on what to do by June the 1st.
Okay, any other comments?
Yeah, well, what we also discussed yesterday was that the so-called Section 232, I mean, we all consider meanwhile as a kind of a trade war and a trade debate and trade discussion, but it was implemented by national security, and so it has nothing to do with it. And so it's amazing that we are all talking about this national security issue, but like a trade case, and that it was really possible to bring such a point to a general debate of what is right and what is wrong in the bilateral agreements with America, Europe, or other nations, and that we are already on such a base of discussion.
They tried many other ways to protect imports to U.S., like anti-dumping cases, CVD cases. Okay, they have given some numbers, some duties to some countries, but at the end nothing has changed. So they had to find something else probably to kind of limit the imports to U.S.
Just the president can decide, so it's much easier for them to decide. So all the others would have been going to the Congress and only on WTO basis. So that one can be decided by one person, literally. So makes it very easy.
Any other comments, Jens?
No, I think if look from the U.S. producer's perspective, I would think keeping the rest of the world in uncertainty might be better.
Can we have the microphone, please? Sorry, Jens.
Sorry. I'm just saying that from a U.S. perspective, it might be something that's better for the domestic market, that to keep the rest of the world in uncertainty. So you might not see final decisions by June 1st.
Yesterday I was reading in Bloomberg that Europe is caving in and seriously considering to a quota system. I think Europe has to show their strength and respect to the WTO and not do such a stupid thing, because the whole idea is obviously like Alf said is stupid. It has nothing to do with the national security. For the whole world to cave in, it's crazy. I think the only group that can stand against that would be obviously Canada or NAFTA and EU. If those fall again, and then we have nothing else left. So it's time for you all to consider going back to your countries and discuss with your own associations and stop this nonsense.
Now, what I want to say, I want to invite all the nations not to fall into the same trap and not to negotiate any quota or an exemption with America. Let the Americans pay 25% on steel compared to the rest of the world.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Fully agree.
No, that's obvious. But as for your comments, I think the WTO thing is unfortunately over. That's what I really think.
And
Okay. Any other comments or questions? Thank you. Moving on to the next question. Obviously, the major issue at the moment is Section 232. So this is once again on Section 232. But this question is for traders, really. The uncertainty created by the Section 232 investigation has caused demand in the US for domestic steel to increase. Apart from this, have there been any effective steps taken by the Trump administration to boost actual overall consumption of steel in the US economy? Has there been any development in relation to the $1 trillion spending on infrastructure promised during his election campaign?
Yeah, well, first, I think what is meant is whether the production increased, not the demand, because I think the demand has not really increased. Maybe the demand on domestic steel, but okay, just to replace imported steel. Yeah, in this respect, certainly, but it can be only done in a very limited way. So we have discussed it already in the preparation meeting and also yesterday that the percentage they may increase is up to 9%. So that will definitely not be sufficient to cover the demand of the country, even if new blast furnaces will be starting up soon. But the numbers we are hearing are 300,000 tons here, 250,000 tons there. So this is nothing which really can make America independent. And to have someone to invest on a trade case in America, in steel, in new productions is very, very unlikely. So we do not believe that this will really boost up a new industry, and also the amount of workers for a blast furnace. We have heard is between 300 and 400 workers. But the downstream industry, who is suffering from much higher steel prices, is 10 times bigger. So in the end of the day, they are really cutting their own leg off. And on the last part of your question, with the 1 trillion spending, okay, we've heard already so many things. What will be done and what his plans are. So far, we haven't really seen not too much becoming true. On the other side, of course, a spending can be announced, but before a spending can go in real investment and paying bills, that takes, of course, years, because the programs have to be put down and investigations have to be made, offers have to be made, and so on. So that will take years, and we won't see that probably in the first phase of his presidentship.
Thank you. Any comments? No. Okay, moving on to the next question. This is for producers, Mr. Chairman. What countries are in pole position to become the main suppliers of steel imports to the US in the immediate term up to June 1st and thereafter?
Well, in the immediate term up to June 1st, there is only a couple of weeks left, so There is no. But after that, it's important of the decision of the U.S. If Europe will be exempt and not the rest of the world not, then it creates a problem for Turks. Of course, Turkey is being one of the major exporters to U.S. and they will have a lot of volumes to go and get it from someplace else, and I think that's going to be quite difficult. And that also is like a chain reaction. Because of that, now Europe is trying to have a safeguard measures against, and we don't know when it's going to be finalized. They have 9 months to do so, but they can take some temporary measures anytime as they please. So there's a lot of confusion. It's like a chess game. If that happens, this happens. If this happens, that happens. You know, we'll just have to. We need the clarity, and as of now, it's quite difficult to answer what happens.
Obviously, difficult to answer all these questions. I
think Michael has something to say on that.
Sorry, Michael, couldn't see that.
Yes, thank you very much. I believe that to expect news on the European Union situation prior to NAFTA being settled, I think is over-optimistic, because the NAFTA relationship is much more important for the trading relationships in the United States. And then the second issue that hasn't been addressed is that Wilbur Ross has mentioned that the United States is going to get tough on circumvention. So that means that, for example, natural flows where slabs are imported from Brazil to Canada and then converted into hot rolled coil and sold into the United States would be considered a circumvention by the Americans. So all of these things are going to affect the situation of how much steel the Americans will be interested in receiving from the European Union.
Thank you. No, it's a very valid point, I guess.
Yes, it's a valid point, but I mean, as Uğur said, the quota system, I don't think it's going to work. As we think about Europe, they have already fulfilled their quota if they were to get quota, because it starts since the beginning of the year. So I think it's best for everyone, I think most of the people here agrees, that to have 25% across the board, so everyone has the same equal competition terms or the same levels to do the business. I think that's the best for everyone. And even if you want to pay duty after you fulfill your quota, it doesn't work. You cannot do that. Once you fulfill your quota, that's it. You cannot ship anything. So that's another thing to think about. Yes.
If you go to a quota system, it's a disaster for Europe and it's a disaster for the world. I can repeat the same. I mean, you have the group here represents a large section in Europe, and you should go back to your organizations and discuss this. A quota system for Europe is a disaster, because then you are bending backwards for the stupid, rules, and like you just said, Murat just said, you have nothing else to ship because you already filled the quota. So that means you're not going to ship anything anymore. It's one thing to say, okay, there's a X amount of duty, for the rest of the world, which is kind of fair for the rest of the world, and it's unfair for the U.S., just like Uğur said. But a quota system is terrible for you. So when you go back to your organizations, talk to them and really discuss, because this is a serious issue for you to do it now.
But there are already examples set for that. That's what I'm afraid of, like Brazil and South Korea, they already got quotas. So I think that might spread out in a way. I don't know, it's just...
It's how you negotiate. The Koreans negotiated a terrible way, and it basically ended their deal, whereas Argentina negotiated with 35% more, which still is in not necessarily the best way. But I think you should not negotiate on something that does not make sense.
That's for sure, but at the end of the day, you have to have some sort of strength to negotiate. It differs from country to country.
You're Europe. Europe is strong. Yeah. Hopefully.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions at this point? No. Thank you. So moving on to the next one, once again the same topic, but the question is for raw materials suppliers. Would you agree that one of the consequences of the tariffs implemented as a result of the Section 232 investigation will be to increase capacity utilization and scrap consumption in the US? If you agree, what would be the impact on the global scrap market?
Yeah, so we've heard now for the past year that there's been discussions about some sort of tariffs into the US, which has itself boosted domestic demand and production in the US, even prior to the implementation of the tariffs. So the effect we've already seen in that demand for raw materials to the US steel industry has grown, and it's at a level now that's higher than it was a year ago. So when it comes to effects on the global scrap trade, we may see a little bit of shifting qualities of different types of raw materials end up in places where they didn't end up before. So we're already seeing this now also in the scrap industry, that European demand and the US demand has been growing, and they use some different qualities which perhaps was shipped elsewhere previously. It now stays in the region. So these kinds of effects we're seeing. So also you can see that in the domestic US market that the prices on the different types of scrap may differ than they compared to what they did before. So these kinds of effects you see.
What would you think about the delta between like shredded scrap price and HMS 1 and 2 scrap price?
Yeah, so these kinds of things where, because in the US market and in the European market, the delta between HMS and shredded might be at a different level than they are in perhaps in the US dollar traded, in for example, Turkey. So if that delta in Turkey remains the same, then you may see less amounts of, for example, shredded material go to the Turkish market. And also prime scrap or higher quality grades may not end up in Turkey because of these things. So, and also because of actual demand in the domestic market. So that's that kind of thing.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. This is once again for the panel. Actually, this was already mentioned before, but let me read the question. What's the maximum level that steel production rates can reach in the US against the backdrop of the Section 232 tariffs? If those levels are achieved, will the US still need to import steel, and in what quantities? What levels will US scrap consumption reach if those maximum steel production rates are achieved? Who wants to start?
Well, as far as I'm reading, I mean, US is targeting 75% of production capacity. But although even if they reach that capacity, they still need to import. It's not enough. There are talks, new mills, many mini mills coming up or being planned for the future, but there is shortage and they still need to import that. Even if they reach that level of 75%, it's not going to be enough.
Even with 80%, they have to.
And then their target is, I don't know, please correct me if I'm wrong, but they are thinking to reach 75%. So that's
yeah.
Okay.
That's what Phil said, right?
Probably that's okay.
Phil Bell said 85%, right?
Yes, overall, it's about 75%, 74%, 75% today. What they're trying to achieve is 85%. But like you were saying, it doesn't make sense because that we are already producing close to 74 or 75 million tons. So if you go 10% more, so we'll be 85, and we import close to 35 million tons. So we still have a serious gap, and that because of that gap, we're going to have to import, no doubt.
Okay. Any other comments, Jens, Willy? No. Okay. Moving on. This is for the traders. Considering the Section 232 tariffs and the safeguard investigations launched first by the EU and then by Turkey, how do you expect trade flows to change? Given the exemptions granted for some countries, how do you think the level playing field in the global steel market will be affected? This has more or less been answered, but if you want to add anything else.
Yeah, well, it has been more or less answered, and I think it's really too early to
Sure.
make any predictions now because nobody really knows who will be excluded, who will make either a quota agreement or not. So I think we really have to see and wait what finally the result will be between these negotiations, and then, of course, one can see how trade flows may change.
Okay. Can we have the microphone? Yes, Mr. Daldeler.
And none of these two investigations have been initiated with their own will. It was initiated because the US have asked them to initiate it. So I don't really foresee any serious outcome. Both sides have agreed the imports are necessary, it's a real fact. So they're just trying to show the America they're doing what they need to do before they sit on the table to negotiate the exemptions. So don't take it too serious.
It's just part of the negotiations. Okay. Any other comments or questions? Nope. Okay, this is for producers. With Turkish mills' rebar sales remaining sluggish due to the Section 232 tariffs and the related exemptions for certain countries, and also due to the EU safeguard investigation and the lack of demand in traditional rebar export markets such as Egypt and the UAE, how will the Turkish rebar producers survive in the coming period? Will they focus on their domestic market exclusively, or will they look for alternative export destinations? Survive may be a little bit harsh, but that's the question.
This would be a very big blow for Turkish steel industry, but Turks are very flexible to find new ways to deal with the problems. Well, it's all what will come out in June the 1st and the near future with these trade wars. This trade war, I don't think it's sustainable. It has to end in somehow, somewhere. Of course, Turkey will also probably plan another safeguard measure or some kind of protectionism against all other imports, because we have actually there's a question about this. I think we have a zero import duty at the moment. But no matter what, if everyone gets across the board 25%, we will have a chance to still export to US. Even if we get 25% and the others don't get, we still might find a chance to export to US, and because they are still asking material in the States, although they have to pay extra $200 for the taxes, still it seems to be workable. They can average the prices out. Today they are getting some material from Europe, from Italy, Spain, Portugal, but I don't think the quantity is enough, so they need to still buy from us. And we are also in the negotiations at the moment, but the time will show us what will happen today. Don't have a definite answer for this.
Thank you. Next one is for raw material suppliers. Jens. What's your prediction for the capacity utilization and scrap consumption of EU mills as a result of the safeguard investigation? Would you expect a negative impact on the scrap exports of EU countries?
I mean, no, because despite, it doesn't really matter what the, In the short term, the U.S. demand for scrap imports is pretty good. Okay, they're a net exporter, but they still import a lot of material from various regions, and we expect that the trade will continue. We don't think. I mean, we expect the trade issues to be somehow resolved, but the capacity utilization in the European market is very strong, and it's strong mostly on its own merits, with a strong growth in the European market. So the demand for the scrap has been very good. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, moving on. This is for traders. What is the main reason for not including semi-finished products in the investigation that the EU has initiated? Really, any ideas?
Well, that is certainly because the steel production industry doesn't want to cut off their own feed, because quite an amount of mills in Europe are depending on imported raw material or semi-products, like Thyssen, who is importing huge amounts of slabs for their hot roll band, others billets for merchant bars, and so on and so forth. And so, of course, the mills do not want to be punished, but they just want to keep off foreign material. But of course, in their own production chain, they do not want to be limited. So that's the only reason.
Sure. Thank you. Next one is for the panel. What's the likelihood that the current global trade tensions will develop into a full-blown trade war? In this event, which countries or regions would have the most to gain? Which would have the most to lose? Would there be any winners? What is the worst-case scenario? A global recession. It's more a gloom scenario. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a strong believer in free trade and open markets, because the market has shown us all the time that it can do better, and politics usually can't do it better. And so famous last words, but if we remember Ronald Reagan, who said 1989 in Berlin, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Yeah, and now the new president in America is building up walls, which is very sad, because it's not for the good of anyone. And that we are not buying American cars is certainly not because of taxes, but because of other reasons. And in the end of the day, if it really comes to a trade war, I think America has a lot to lose, because the Europeans are watching very carefully the tax exemptions which are existing on companies like Amazon, like Starbucks and so on, who are literally not paying any taxes in Europe. And you've certainly seen what debates we have with Ireland, who granted really dumping margins. And I think on that field, America can become a big loser. That will certainly hurt a lot. Of course, the other losers will certainly be Europe and Turkey, if we are talking about steel now. And I think the whole world will lose, because uncertainty, protectionism, safeguards, and so on is not helping to grow the world.
Couldn't agree more.
Any other comments?
No, everybody's a loser if there's global trade wars. So I don't think intentions are that there are to be a trade war.
Thank you. Probably the only winner will be who has made 800 million net profit and 1.2 billion net profit in the last couple of years, and expected to have 2 billion this year. Anyway, Okay, let's move on to the next question. This is for the producers. Turkey reduced its import duty on rebar from 30% to 0% in response to requests from its construction industry. Have Turkish rebar producers been negatively impacted in a tangible way by this measure? Is the safeguard investigation initiated by Turkey just a reaction to increasing protectionism internationally, or is there a serious threat of excessive steel export volumes to Turkey? The second part has been answered by Mr. Dalbeler already. So let's hear your comments on the first part.
The import duties has been reduced from 30 to 10, from 10 to 0 lately. So we haven't felt the real threat at the moment, but we know that small volumes are started to come to be imported to Turkey. I don't know if it's going to continue. I mean, if this trade war keeps escalating, of course, at the end, that's what's going to happen if we don't take precautions to protect imports to Turkey. But as of now, there are talks of safeguard measures in Turkey as well. So we have to protect what is ours as well. And this is also something, as Uğur also said earlier, that's some kind of leverage talks with the U.S. because the U.S. is saying, I'm protecting my borders or my imports, and I expect you to do the same. Mm-hmm. So we come to terms. So at the moment there are no threats, but I think we'll have to somehow, somewhere, to find a way to stop this and to maybe put a safeguard measure as well.
Just in case. Okay, thank you. Moving quickly to the next question. I've got 4 questions left, by the way. This is for the Raw Material Suppliers Committee, Jens. China exported 2.2 million metric tons of ferrous scrap in 2017. Some market players in other parts of the world say it is inevitable for China to make the switch to being a ferrous scrap exporter, with some predicting a major influx of newly exported scrap hitting the global market by the end of the decade. What's your opinion at this point of time? You have already mentioned the worries that
we discussed this point a little bit in yesterday's session, and there were some experiences from China directly recently, who also noted that there's an environmental drive in China that's currently preceding most other things. Producers are measured on environmental production to produce material with higher quality iron ore grades, for example, to not emit as much, and also to add scrap to their melts in order to handle the domestic generation of scrap. And then there's also a investment program into scrap melting steel mills. So just like we saw in the last 10 years when the Chinese growth slowed, we saw there was imbalances between the steel production growth and the actual consumption, and therefore we saw exports of steel. We may of course in the short term see scrap exports from China, but the generation of scrap last year was 148 million tons, according to figures, and the exports were about 2 million tons, which is a very small fraction of the total generation. And so with export duties in China and environmental focus, we concluded yesterday that we don't see a long-term export of scrap from China. You will see Chinese domestic scrap be utilized in the domestic steel sector as far as it's possible.
Thank you.
What is the quality of Chinese scrap?
I mean, it varies, of course. The quality of the Chinese scrap varies heftily, and the country is large, and it has difficulties with internal transportation. So in some areas you'll see exports, and in some areas you'll see imports, like in the United States, where you see scrap generation on the coasts, and you see steel production in the center of the U.S. You have difficulty in transporting the material to the domestic mills. You see some exports and you see some imports. Qualities, yeah, the qualities are very different, I would say. But in the heavy material is of course used in the first case, and then the light material is exported. But and some is imported. So you'll see that in the future as well.
So Jens, here. Hi. So if I may, just a little bit of context on the China scrap supply from last year. I mean, I guess the thing to keep in mind is that, you know, yes, it's 100 million, 140 million, depending on who you talk to, but not a lot of it is processed. A lot of it is inland. You know, they still haven't got it to recycling yards for processing. So, you know, I think when you look at very large numbers like that, one of the things to sort of consider is how much of it is actually prepared scrap, you know, that can actually be exported or consumed. So it's just something that I wanted to share with you guys, because when you start looking at numbers like that, the whole dynamic sort of looks very different. The other thing to keep in mind is that in terms of scrap consumption in China, apart from moving more to electric capacity, there's also a push to increase utilization in the current sort of integrated structure. Every percentage increase in scrap utilization at that BF-BOF route is 6 million tons. You know, so the numbers are quite staggering when it comes to China. So I think, you know, everything that we've heard, you know, I think what you sort of said a minute back is spot on. Sort of 3-month, 6-month periods might create some sort of, you know, fluxes where you might see a sudden spurts in exports, but overall, it actually does look like they're building a sort of reservoir for their own consumption. So if there's at any point any data that you get on how much of that 100, 140 million tons is actually processed, I think that would be an incredibly useful number.
Thank you. It's going to be a long debate on this issue, I guess. Anyway, any other questions or comments? Moving on to the last 3 questions. This is for traders. China's relative absence from the export markets is a decisive factor which buoys up sentiment in the global long steel market. Production cuts in China have been extended beyond the winter season. Environmental measures continue to be implemented. China's central bank has cut the reserve ratio requirement for Chinese lenders, which is expected to boost domestic steel demand. From these factors, can we safely say that China will continue to remain absent from the export markets in the coming period? Or could anything happen that would change this situation? Absent is a relative term, of course.
Well, it's also not so easy to answer. Certainly, China is undergoing a constant change and improvement in the environmental measurements. So certainly they will continue to close unproductive, illegal, and also polluting factories and production plants. And they will transform them into electric arc furnace productions, as we have heard yesterday from Mr. Ma. So the capacity they are going to build up is between 40 to 50 million tons on top. On the other side, they will reduce capacities from those illegal and old-fashioned productions in a very similar ratio. But there will be a slight surplus in the end, according to Mr. Marr, by about 20 million tons. So 20 million sounds a lot for us and for European style, but for China it's relatively small in regard of the overall demand. So what we all learned, I think, over the last 18 months is that, first of all, China has been severely hit by a lot of trade cases all over the world, especially talking about flat rolled products, special steel, and wire rod is dumped in most of the areas of the world. So I think they learned their lesson already. They know that they cannot swamp material into the various markets because the risk of an anti-dumping is constantly there. And I think it's also not their model to really produce those capacities or to build up those capacities for swamping the material into the markets abroad. So they are building up those plans for their own consumption, that there is, of course, depending on the construction season or on the demand, that there is a surplus at the one or other given time, that they also look for opportunities if the prices are competitive and there is a chance to sell in a modest way. They are going to do that, but it's not that there is someone sitting in Beijing saying, okay, now we move with this product into that area of the world and we will make everybody out of business. So I think the threat from China is not there. Of course, they are a giant in regard of production, but I think they learned that they have to organize it in a better way, and they've done it already, and so we do not foresee that they will be completely absent from the market, but in a modest way.
Thank you. Any other comments? Peter, can we have the microphone for Peter?
Yeah, hi, it's Peter Marcus. So I disagree 100% with that last opinion and the great amount of what I've been hearing this morning, to tell you the truth. In China, we know that typically with the hundreds of smaller producers, they keep producing more when the price is high. They have very low fixed costs. And we've had a non-recurring event in China, a series of non-recurring events, the close down of the induction furnace facilities, the limitation of the production of sinter plants because of pollution, a rise in demand, and there was a shortage of rebar in China last year twice, so severe that the price went to a $50 to $60 premium to the price of hot-rolled band. So what's going to happen going forward is the Chinese are in the process of goosing up, of boosting their steel production due to high prices. This production will exceed demand. They will cut their price to marginal cost when demand weakens, and they are going to be a major force exporting long products, rebar, wire rod, for which the government reduced the duties as of January 1st. They will be exporting less scrap because of the 40% duty on scrap, and who knows when the government might reduce that duty. You have another point. If you look at profits in the electric arc furnace industry, when are profits high? When the price of scrap is high. With all this overproduction and the rising supply of scrap in China in the years ahead, what does that mean? It means lower scrap prices. Lower scrap prices means lower margins for most people in this room. You are now in a period of boom, of a golden profit age for the steel industry that's going to be ending probably in 3 months. So beware, you're happy here, you're facing a calamity, folks.
So would you suggest all the countries to put more emphasis on safeguard measures? would you suggest all the countries to put more emphasis on safeguard measures to protect themselves from Chinese exports?
So at World Steel, I think scrap is a ubiquitous product, and I don't think scrap import duties is something that is likely to happen. So you're in an age of management, and it's now time for the people in this room to anticipate what's going to happen, take actions to improve your competitive standing, and realize when you're sitting here a year from now, you're not going to be happy.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Mr. Sharda, can we have the microphone for Mr. Sharda?
Good morning. This is my first time I'm attending this conference here. So let me introduce myself. I'm Vijay Sharda. I'm the chairman of the Sharda Group. As a steel making, we do 1 million ton steel and we'll be expanding to another 2 million ton. We are into long products. We do international trade about 1.5 million ton, which includes the metallics and semis and finished product. India, as I mentioned, the second largest. And this will be done, what I'm going to share will be cheer up everyone who are into long product manufacturing. They will be very happy to hear from me. India, I talk very practical because I've been in the steel industry for the last 45 years. I'm the third generation from the family. And therefore, being the active member of World Steel Association, active member of Southeast Asia Iron Steel Institute, I sit on the board of India's the most premier apex bodies, Confederation Indian Industry, Federation India Chamber of Commerce, and Federation Indian Mineral Industries. I'm in the managing committee of all the three. I'll be very fast, I'll be very quick. India context, we have added in last 15 years, India has added all capacities mostly into the flat product. Of 120 million ton, it's the almost 80 million ton in the flat product, or 75 million ton is the flat product, and about 45 million ton is the long product. Government going to bring some strict norms in terms of like we have Bureau of Indian Standard, BIS, every country have the quality norms. That will create difficulty, the smaller and medium-sized units like in China last year, they closed down all induction furnaces and 100 million ton capacity was closed in China, which was exporting the cheaper rebar and which was exporting the cheaper billet. It's not that China has increased its consumption of the rebar. The 100 million out of 100 million tons, 60 or 70 million ton, which was coming in the export market, was mostly coming from the secondary route, the induction route, which was getting exported out of China. Now, India, as the government has planned that by 2030, our steel consumption will cross 250 million ton. We are the country with the population of 1,300 million people. Our per capita consumption is only 70-75 kg. Should we talk about 150 kg, 10 years down the line, we'll be needing 250 million. And all we know, to build up a nation, first you should have the long product. Once you become from developing nation to a developed nation, you have deep pockets, then you have the more requirement of the flat product in terms of automobile, in terms of the white goods. So in India context, we are going to have acute shortage. Take my words, today is 8th of May. Everybody should remember, next 3 to 4 years' time, India will emerge one of the largest importer of long products, particularly for the rebar and wire rod. This country will be importing, not to talk about 8 or 10, it will go to 15 or 20 or 25 million ton. You will see between 2021 to 2015 or 16, India would remain the largest importer of the long product across the globe. I can go into any length of discussion, but we appreciate the time and everybody has the right, because I'm in the steel and I know at the macro level how the things functions. Thank you for everybody's attention.
Thank you, Mr. Sharda. Thanks for the good news, by the way. I think we are going to be covered in case Peter is right. Okay. Any other comments or questions? All right, moving on to the last two questions. This is for the producers. We have heard a lot from Dr. Ma yesterday, but the question is on, for the field. Do you think the electrode supply shortage has been relieved to some extent, or is it still significantly affecting the steel industry?
Well, I think it's been relieved in a sense, but only thing is that it costs more. Hello? Can I? Mic is on. I lost my microphone. Yeah, it's better. Well, it's of course the shortage of electrode is released in some extent, but it's only costing a lot more than what it cost a year and a half ago. It's a fact that we need more electrodes due to more and more electric arc furnaces being built, and we also heard yesterday more, induction furnaces have been due to environmental issues, and they being very old, dismantled, and instead they have been built new electric arc furnaces. Therefore, we're going to be needing more and more electrodes. The cost of electrode is increasing not only due to supply and demand imbalance, but it's also the base material of needle coke cost is increasing, and that also affects, of course, the price of graphite electrode. You need about 1.5 kilogram of electrode to produce 1 metric tons of steel, which is today about $25–30. A year and a half ago, it was about $5 or so. So the cost of producing steel, just due to electrode cost, is increased about $25 today. As today, the shortage is not there, but as long as you have the price to pay.
As long as you pay, there are electrodes, huh? Okay. Any questions, comments? None? So we are on to the next question. This is the traditional question on financing, Jens. What's the current situation in the financing of trading scrap and or other raw materials?
Yeah, so when it comes to the trade financing, it's ample at the moment. The interest in financing is strengthening, I guess. But of course, there's still difficulties in the sort of dock financing, pre-financing of ferrous scrap raw materials, which we won't see come back. But in general, the situation in the steel industry and the raw materials industry, it seems to be returning a little bit because the businesses are doing better in general. But it's of course liquidity strengthening, straining to be in a growth situation and add demand. But in general, the businesses have been more healthy.
Thank you. Okay, I'm done with my questions. Any other questions or comments from the floor? I think we're all done. Great. So I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, the chairman of the IREPAS committees, Mr. Jens Björkman, chairman of IREPAS Raw Material Suppliers Committee, Mr. Willy Alf, the chairman of IREPAS Traders Committee, and Mr. Murat Cebecioğlu, the chairman of IREPAS Producers Committee and the chairman of IREPAS. I also would like to thank you all for your contributions, joining us this morning at the very early hour, for all your contributions and comments. There is a problem with me. And I'd like to thank our sponsors, starting with our platinum sponsor, İçtaş, Alex Stewart International, Baştu Metallurgy, Liberty House Group, Link Inspection Expertise Services, Belgian Scrap Terminal, and Chartered Shipbrokers. Once again, thanks for joining us, listening to us, and I hope we can see each other in Istanbul from September 16th to 18th while we celebrate the 35th anniversary of IREPAS. Thanks a lot and have a safe journey.